Hello, everyone. It's Roelof here. It's 10:30 Pacific time and time to kick off. Firstly, welcome, Jack. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us today. For those who don't know, I've had the pleasure to work with Jack for over a decade now, and it's a true career highlight to have the opportunity to work with you, Jack. I've told you that privately. I'll say it publicly too. You welcomed me on the board when we led the financing, what was then called Square, now called Block, in late 2009. And it's a privilege for me to continue to serve on the board and work with you. And one of the reasons is your passion for continued innovation and your embrace of entrepreneurship within the business. And one of my all-time favorite quotes, Jack quotes, is that companies have multiple founding moments. And a wonderful illustration is Cash App, a service that was born 5 years after the company first was started. Just this continued innovation. And it continues today with Block's announcement in late last year that it has several different business units with Square, Cash App, Tidal, TBD, and various initiatives that we have underway as the company continues to reinvent and innovate. Now, the topic for today's conversation is crypto. And in many ways, what's happening in crypto reminds me of when I first got a ZX Spectrum when I was a kid, or when I first encountered the internet. When I came to Silicon Valley and I saw the rise of broadband and mobile and cloud computing, there's so much energy and inventiveness and a sense in which it's a new technology frontier, and we don't quite appreciate the scale of what might be in front of us and all the opportunities that lie ahead. And like in many of those other waves, sometimes there's a bit of overhype in the short run, but we typically underestimate these technologies in the long run. Jack's been a big proponent of Bitcoin since the very beginning. And Block is working on some interesting things, and we're going to talk about that as part of this conversation. But for those who may not realize this, Cash App launched Bitcoin capability in January 2018, 4 years ago. And we have a business unit called TBD, which is dedicated to crypto, and Spiral, a subsidiary focused on funding Bitcoin development. Now, Sequoia 2 has been active in crypto for several years. And in the last 12 months, 1 in 5 of our investments was crypto related. So we're enthusiastic about the space. And in the spirit of learning in public, we're inviting the brightest people we know to have conversations and to demystify some of what's happening in crypto. So we're excited to welcome Jack and get his thoughts. Quick housekeeping, we'll probably spend about 30 minutes or so in conversation, and we'd love to open it up for Q&A at that point. So start thinking of questions you have, and either Jack or I will take some questions in a bit. So let me kick off with the first question. Last year, Jack, you attended Sequoia Basecamp, our founder event, and you talked about how your first encounter in reading Satoshi's white paper. And I'm just curious, can you talk about how did you learn of it? How did you react? What resonated with you? What did you envision it might become?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks for doing this, Roelof. And you've been incredible for me and us as a mentor as we built our company and come such a far way. And also given us the ability to take risk as well, which is the only reason that we as a company could be in this space. I I when I first discovered the internet, I discovered Usenet, and when I discovered Usenet, I found all these weird subs and groups, and the one that was most exciting was alt cypherpunks, and it was a bunch of hackers and cryptographers and geeks and nerds who were focused on privacy and giving people simple tools to enhance their privacy. And there was a lot of discussion of PGP at the time, and I don't know if many of you may remember the PGP code as an export, as treated as a munition. So the export of such was banned, and people were writing the code on T-shirts and just putting it all over the world. That was all found in that alt cypherpunks group, and the big focus was on money. That was the holy grail, and there was a lot of energy and a lot of posts around how cryptography could be applied to money so that the people own it, so that they have an open monetary network, open system, and there were a bunch of projects that I saw the updates around within that group, and it was just a persistent fascination for me. Um, especially as I was getting into hacking and programming and computer science, applied cryptography was like the Bible at the time, and um, the whole world kind of intersected. And I didn't really do much with it except passively learn as much as I could um, until 2009, when there was just this energy in the air. This was right after the financial collapse of 2008. Um, 2009, you had companies like Stripe, obviously you had Square start, and you also had the beginnings of Bitcoin. So both the code and the white paper came at the very end of 2008, 2009. And it was interesting because, in that time, like the year after this collapse, there was an opening for technology around money and technology around finance. So we saw a lot of companies and projects start during that time. And I read the white paper right away. I thought it was absolutely beautiful in its simplicity, in how powerful it was. I mean, certainly solving the Byzantine generals problem was incredible. But the way it was released under a pseudonym, um, completely in the open. The source came later. The Genesis block and the network came shortly thereafter. And I just thought it was so special to have something that seemed so powerful be released without any ego, without attaching to a real identity. Having this unknown entity put this out there as a gift. I mean, it was just purely a gift, and everything that followed, um, you know, made me realize how powerful this project was. When Satoshi left the community and disappeared about 2 years after, Bitcoin carried on, and um, all these developers, all these people who saw the power of it, um, owned it, contributed to it, were fascinated by it, were building around it or building on it. Um, they just carried through on this vision and built upon it and kept doing the right thing, even through a consensus development, consensus model around development, which was also amazing. There were a lot of challenges for Bitcoin over the years, from governments to um, narratives around criminal use cases to energy to miners attacking to forks, but it's been resilient to all that. Um, it's had nearly 100% uptime, hasn't been hacked. It's extremely secure because of all this participation around it. And it moves in a very deliberate way, which some would see as a negative, as that it's slow, but those things tend to be the things that ultimately last over time. So I was just fascinated about it. Square tried to build it into our systems in 2014. We enabled anyone who went to our online store to pay with Bitcoin and auto convert for our sellers, for our merchants, into fiat currency so they didn't have to think about it. Wasn't really used at that time. But in 2017, 2018, we had Cash App, and it felt like a very natural place. So me and this guy, Mike Brock, at Square at the time, he was working on Cash App, and there was a hack week, and we worked together on integrating Bitcoin into Cash App for our hack week project, and got it working in like 4 days, and then wanted to continue to see it through. And this was challenging for us because we were a public company at that point, first public company to have to talk to the SEC about Bitcoin, explain what it is, and why we're interested. It changed everything about the company for the better. It improved our security models, how we thought around privacy, how we thought about development, obviously investor relations, and everything about the company changed in that moment, all for the better. If there's nothing else that Bitcoin has done for me and our company, it's just taught us so much. And even today, um, we we released, or we announced two projects, both for Bitcoin, three projects actually, all for Bitcoin. One is TBD, the next is a Bitcoin wallet, and the next is a Bitcoin miner. And because of what we learned from Bitcoin, we're building everything completely in the open source, for the hardware devices. Even the hardware industrial design will be open source, because we want to make sure that we're continuing to give back to this community, especially the open source community that companies like ours take so much from, but don't really give enough back to. So it changed the course of how we think about development and how we engage with this community that we want to help as much as we can, and we don't want to just profit from. We want to give back as much as we can as well, especially in meaningful ways such as development.
Well, thank you. There are a million questions that are buzzing through my mind right now. One of them is, CEO of big public company, co-CEO of two companies at the time, has time and energy and inventiveness to go and work on a Hack Week project for a couple of days on something that is so strategically important, which is wonderful. It was that is amazing, all the way to the long-term potential of Bitcoin. I want to pick off where you just ended there with giving back to the community, and maybe can you talk about Spiral? You didn't mention that. What is Spiral exactly? For those who don't know, if you can explain what we're doing with that and why we're funding it.
Yeah, I mean, after we launched Bitcoin and Cash App, um, I had a conversation with Mike Brock again. Um, he's the one I originally did this Hack Week project with, and um, I asked, like, what would be the greatest thing that we could do, greatest impact thing that we could do for the Bitcoin community, and he thought for probably 30 seconds, and he said we should hire some open source developers and pay them to work on Bitcoin. And it just immediately resonated with me. He was quick to say it because he came from Red Hat. He saw the power of that intersection between a corporate entity and an open source community, and how it could be symbiotic, and how it could be beneficial to one another. And we called up Amrita, our CFO, or I texted her, I think, maybe 30 minutes after that, and said, "Can we dedicate 5 million a year to hiring these engineers to work on Bitcoin projects, whatever they choose? We're not going to give them any direction. We're not going to assume that we can use anything they produce. We just want to fund the community in this particular way." And we figured it out. We dedicated it. We did a bunch of interviews to find a lead. We found this incredible gentleman, Steve Lee, who is very tapped into the community of Bitcoin, um, lifelong learner, uh, understood all the ups and downs of the project over time, and also the people. And we hired him. He wanted to be paid in Bitcoin, so we got working to set that up. And then he hired four other people, and they all had a choice. Like, are they all going to work on one thing for Bitcoin, or are they all going to do their own individual things? We didn't care, and we made sure that we had enough structure, so that they didn't have to take or worry about any direction from us. And they decided ultimately that they wanted to work as one team, and they wanted to work on Lightning, and they wanted to work on making Lightning accessible to more people by way of creating a software development kit for wallets, so that a wallet anywhere around the world could just take up this software development kit, build Lightning in, and without having to think that much about it. And as they updated the code, the wallet improved as well. So they did that, and then 2 years later, and this is the thing I'm most proud of, as Cash App was considering integrating Lightning, um, they obviously looked around at all the technology, and they picked Spiral's software development kit. So the open source initiative that we set up, with no hopes or assumptions around us ever being able to use anything they produce, actually allowed the Cash App team to move quick to one of the goals it had, which was to integrate Lightning and to all of our Cash App accounts. And they did so very quickly, and LDK made it that much easier. So I definitely encourage companies to look at opportunities to hire open source developers to focus on improving the community in whatever field they're in. And you never know. You may have some unexpected benefits and upside. But even if we didn't, if they decide to work on something that Square, now Block, could never use, um, we would still be proud of the fact that we started and carried on the team, because they are giving back to that community, and they are making the system better every single day through their focus. And now they're hiring more people and giving grants to developers all around the world. They gave a grant to a NIM, someone whose real identity we don't even know. And again, that pushed the boundaries of what an organization like that can do, and what an organization that funds it can do, such as Block. Um, but everything we've done for Spiral, and everything they've done, Steve has been working on. I think he's probably released some of it, but a playbook so that other companies can do similar things and learn from all the mistakes we made, and all the successes we've had as well.
So that reminds me of a lot of the original spirit in the internet, which was sort of a norm of reciprocity, a give and a get. You've been vocal about Web3 and how companies, VCs, just entrepreneurs are interacting with the crypto community at large. And when I saw that in December, I called you to get your advice because I wanted to shape our thinking at Sequoia and make sure that we also are sensitive to doing what is right by the community and to productively engage. Can you maybe share some of beyond what you've just described as Spiral? Can you maybe share just what you think the norm should be as people engage?
Yeah, I so I tweeted some time ago, and this got a lot of pickup in conversation, obviously, around Web3, and that um, a lot of the folks I saw. I mean, first and foremost, I have some critiques of Ethereum and Solana and a lot of the other chains that were inspired by Bitcoin, and we can discuss those. Um, but what I was seeing in particular that I wanted to call out is that a lot of Web3 was being branded as this decentralized utopia. And if you actually look at the technology, and you look at who's behind some of the technologies, um, you see that there's a lot of centralizing forces at play, especially a lot of VCs, and one VC in particular, which I ended up calling out because I entered the chat a bit. But I I wanted to make people aware of the fact that, like, you have to know what you're getting into. Um, this is not this utopia that is being as it's being marketed right now. It's something that is there's certainly some interesting technologies, and certainly some interesting spirit to it, and great ideas. But let's be real around how this is being built, and let's be real about who owns it, and let's be real about who has the vote to set the direction going forward. And it's okay that they have that ownership, and it's okay that they can control it in a dramatic and outsized way, but be upfront about it. So I called out that, like, know what you're getting into. This is owned by these VCs and their LPs, and it's no different from what we saw with Web 2. And a lot of people called me out for being the quote unquote Web 2 person, uh, considering potentially being disrupted by Web 3. But I learned a ton building Web 2 companies. A lot I don't like and will never do again. And again, I appreciate a lot of the spirit of decentralization, and what's going the the optimistic nature of Web 3, but the reality does not match right now. And I think people just have to be aware of that, and be careful. And I want to make sure that we're building something that is truly solving someone's use cases, and that if we're able to do that in a decentralized way, that we pick a platform that is secure, that has been tested, that is private, and that has the attributes that allow us to have more predictability around the direction. And for me, that is Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't have all the development and all the attributes that you might find in an Ethereum and Solana, but that is by design. There is that deliberate yet slow development cycle for Bitcoin because the, the developer community around it is very cautious because this is meant to be a global monetary network. This is meant to be as a potential replacement to the US dollar's dominance, and you can't screw that up. Um, but there are certainly opportunities down the line to build something, and some of the ideas that you see brandied about in Web3 on a secure Bitcoin stack, with all the knowledge that we have and all the mistakes that have been made and all the lessons. So right now I consider Ethereum and Solana a bit of a sandbox. There's some incredible ideas there, but I think it's on a very weak and ultimately centralized foundation.
Got it. So do you think when you place a lot of value in decentralization, why do you care so much about that?
Well, there's no single individual in the world who is necessarily um, looking at decentralization as the pure attribute that they want when they consider a service that they want to use on the internet. It's something that allows for more privacy. It's something that allows for more protection. But if you don't have the right experience, if you don't have it solving the job in a focused way that people are hiring it to do in the first place, decentralization ultimately doesn't matter because you have to work around it just to get that attribute of decentralization. So for me, as you said, what what really inspired me about Bitcoin early and also today, it felt like the early internet. It had the same sort of energy. It had the weirdness. It had the punk aspect of it. It had, a lot of the aspects around challenging the establishment and challenging specifically the corporations. So for me, it's less around the decentralization aspect, although I think that's critical for some of the use cases that we want to enable. It's more around the open, transparent, global nature of the thing. So for me, what you know, Bitcoin in the U.S. and Europe, there's a lot of desire around it. Bitcoin in Central America and South America and Africa, there's necessity around it because the banks, the corporations there are so terrible and leave so many people out of the economy. And that is enabled by those governments as well. Or you have inflation at completely unstable and um, unhealthy degrees, even hyperinflation, where it's over 50%, where the people don't have any other options. So the use case of Bitcoin for remittance, for instance, for someone in Ghana who wants to send their money back to their family in Nigeria, it's a 30% Western Union tax versus, you know, 50 cents. So the choice is clear. So I think in the US and Europe and Australia, we kind of get trapped in this bubble of well, Bitcoin is, not that valuable because no one really needs it. And we ignore the rest of the world where it's actually needed. And it's actually, the more it becomes a global currency, the more people within those countries can participate on the same level that we have the privilege of doing so in the United States and Europe and Australia and India and places like that. So it's really, really important that we have something that is open, that is transparent, that is not owned by any one particular corporation, not owned by any one particular bank. The decisions in DC do not affect the people in Nigeria, but instead they can see how the network operates. They can see the source code. They can contribute to it to make it work for their community as well. They can build a wallet on top of it to make it more approachable. That's what I care about. Decentralization is it's certainly an enabler into a bunch of those things, but the openness, the lack of corporate ownership, the lack of government um, ownership or ability to uh, censor it in any way are some of the most important things.
I've always thought of the potential power of technology is the ability to bring things that used to be reserved for an exclusive minority and make it available for everyone. You know, the meaning of democratization of technology that people often bandy about, I think people lose sight of what it really means, and it's this inclusiveness that you just described. How do we get more people to be able to participate in financial services that we take for granted in a developed country? Um, it's amazing. Is that part of what was behind TB Dex, by the way, that we just released?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like for me, the reason I'm so focused on Bitcoin at the expense of nearly everything else right now is because money is so foundational to the financial system. Money is so foundational to participation in the economy in the first place. And I've said this elsewhere, but if if Bitcoin existed before Twitter existed, I think we'd see very different revenue models. We wouldn't be so dependent upon ad revenue models. We wouldn't be so dependent upon surveillance capitalism as the only way to provide global services for the internet. And it would certainly allow our business at Block and Square to move much faster because we don't have to go market by market and form a relationship with the bank there. Bank doesn't even want it because they fear that we're going to be competing with them. And this is very real for many startups. And if you look at the entrepreneurs in Nigeria and Ghana, like just even getting started in their country, but competing on a global scale is nearly impossible because of this setup. It's the banks controlling it. It's these corporations that have these monopolies. So that leads us to TBDEX, which is the problem Bitcoin has right now is you need a local exchange. The on ramps and off ramps are still fairly immature. There's still a lot of control around them. And TBDEX hopes to build a network of distributed exchanges so that anyone effectively could create an exchange and create a local fiat on ramp into Bitcoin. And of course, you get the off ramp as well. And these on ramps and off ramps can have any properties that you want, and then the market decides which one's valuable, which one's not valuable. And in the same way that we're launching the Bitcoin miner and the Bitcoin wallet, we're doing this completely open source, and the roadmap will be open, and everything we we intend all of our discussions around our decisions will be open. I see Matt Mullenweg on this and service that embodies the open source and kind of corporate balance, and really appreciate you, Matt. But we're trying to do something. The more you can open, the more you can be transparent. Um, the, the higher the potential is for trust and earning some trust. So um, we we want to make sure that it's easy to get into Bitcoin, it's easy to get off Bitcoin, and that's what TBDEX is about at a high level.
So, in addition to TBDEX, there was the spiral investment or funding of sort of improving wallet capability. What are the other limitations to getting Bitcoin to realize its full potential? People sometimes talk about transaction capacity and speed. Um, what else do you think needs to be solved for Bitcoin to really realize its potential?
Uh, Lightning is addressing a bunch. Lightning is addressing speed. Lightning is addressing privacy, um, and I think the biggest thing is there haven't been a lot of designers um, in mass entering in the Bitcoin community. So design leads to accessibility. So Steve and the Spiral team have worked really hard to help foster a design community around Bitcoin, um, and that community is growing very very quickly, especially outside the U.S. and outside Europe, which is heartening. Again, it's out of necessity instead of desire. Um, so I think the biggest need is around accessibility. Um, there's a constant focus on security. There's a constant focus on privacy, anonymity, and speed. But a lot of that is happening with Lightning, which is a layer on top of Bitcoin that allows you to transact in a much faster way and a more private way as well.
But one of the challenges with anonymity is that it um, attracts the ire of central banks who liken it to bearer securities and then worry that it gets used for nefarious purposes. So, how do we square the anonymity with it? Ultimately, governments do want to regulate and oversee what happens, or do you think we can be free of that constraint?
Well, if that's what they want, they should cancel cash because there's nothing more anonymous or or better for criminal activity and fraud than paper dollar. So,
That's true.
and it seems that the trend is that they are attempting to cancel cash and looking at ways to create central bank digital currencies, which I think is a terrible direction because again, you have governments and in this case unelected officials making decisions around the attributes of money. And you look at what China is doing with its digital currency. There's an attribute on it that allows them to expire the money, and you can imagine some of the outcomes in that as well. If I could just say that your money is null and void after this particular date, what does that incentivize you to do? And who's in control of that? So I think with all these things, we have to be really careful as to who owns these decisions. Are they completely visible? Are we able to elect the people to make those decisions? Um, and that's again what I appreciate about Bitcoin is because the rule set is transparent and the rule set is constrained by this consensus model that you have between the developers, the miners, and the people who run nodes and use Bitcoin. Um, and it's only through that consensus that development is moved forward. So I think it's really powerful, and I think it's very unique. I've never seen another project like it, and I hope that there are so many more because it works, and I think it's what the world needs right now because the world has been too closed off and algorithms buried in corporations and you know decision making rubrics and in governments that people just don't have access to and they get no explanation around.
Yeah, I must say, when you described the central bank digital currency just now, it had very in mind all the negative
Yeah.
things that come with absolute power and control. It is interesting that I felt like the early days of the internet was about a promise of decentralization and freedom, and slowly that's been encroached on by governments and firewalls that countries put up and more censorship. And I do think part of the reaction that I sense from this is just the innate desire for people to not be constrained in that way, to not be subject to absolute power and control by a government. So,
I think some of that is certainly right, but I would put the focus more on the companies. Like the early,
hmm.
the internet was obviously created by the government. It's created by the U.S. military. Academia took it over, and then the internet really flourished, and it flourished in a very decentralized way. Usenet, IRC, email. But there was one problem that I think created more centralization of the internet, which was the discovery problem. It's just really hard to find things on the internet. It's hard to find communities that you might be interested in. It's hard to find the web pages that you want to learn from or read or reference. And that's what spawned Google, and that's what spawned Deja News and Facebook and Twitter and all these things. It was the discovery problem had to be centralized because it was just more practical and it was easier, and we didn't have the technology to decentralize discovery, but now we do. And I think all these things ebb and flow, and I think the internet now has the technology to flow back to a more decentralized reality. But at the same time, we need to we need to be careful that like a lot of the same people that helped fund and build, myself included, um, the centralized solution to discovery are now in this decentralized world, um, but they're not necessarily, you know, giving up all the information around their ownership or how they think about governance or how they think about building or why their technologies are resilient, rock solid, and that's what we need more of. We need more of the transparency. The early internet, the decentralized internet was completely open, completely transparent. Every single fundamental technology in it you could get the source code to. That is not true today. And if there's anyone moving in the space and they're moving in a closed source way, or they're funding behind closed doors, I would question it because there's a lot of money to be made there, and there's a lot of ownership, and there's obviously going to be some outcomes from the directions people set.
Yeah. So maybe before we turn it over to questions from some of the listeners, I was curious to sort of prognosticate for a second. It's 10 years from now, and crypto's potential has matured. How do you think the world looks differently?
In 10 years,
5, just some number. I mean, we do this exercise. It's one of the wonderful exercises we used to do at Square, right? The pre-mortem and pre-parade, where we say it's 5 years from now. What does success look like? And if we didn't succeed, why did we not succeed? And it's so clarifying to focus on first order issues. So I'm stealing something I learned from you in the Square
yeah,
board.
yeah. I think I I think for for Bitcoin and all the other projects around it, I think if we're increasing transparency within the next 5 to 10 years, if we're increasing participation, and that participation is globally represented, um, if we're if we're providing daily utility, especially in the form of currency globally, that is success. Um, if it is if it continues to be buried in a lot of the um, critiques, it means that we're not doing a great job at showing how it works, educating around the critiques that people have, um, and trying to diminish those. I think if a company or uh, a particular VC owns the majority of this new space, we've completely failed. Because again, it goes back to a centralized model where the people don't actually own it. And the only success in my mind is the people truly can see and can truly own this, and specifically the most important part of it, which is the money, and the currency that we use every day to transact around the world.
Thank you. Now, quite a few people that have sort of raised their hand to participate. Jack, do you see anyone you recognize that you want to invite on stage?
This is my first time co-hosting a Twitter space, so let me see. All the people I know are listeners, so you all go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. I think Chloe has been add a speaker. I'm trying this for the first time too. Chloe, I think you're on stage now. Do you have a question? She's connecting.
Yep.
Chloe, you're on mute. If you can go off mute.
Oh.
No,
Hey.
Aaron Levy just. Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Chloe.
Hey, sorry, I think my internet is not smooth tonight. I didn't
Okay,
hear it
happens
was
to all
my
of us.
turn. Thank you. Thank you so very much for this space and hosting it. It's insightful to hear your input. And so here's me. I have a question for you. And before that, I just want to say, so I just less than a year since April, May last year, I was still completely a newbie. So I was working with fashion, and I got scammed. And I somehow, as a person, I'm very curious. So I wanted to find out what this is. What is Bitcoin? What is Ethereum? What is DeFi? So then I dived in, and within 5 months, I really living and breathing in the space, and I understood what this is. And the more that I learn, the more that I am convinced that this is the future. I want this to be the future as well, because it's really exciting, and I see what this can do for every one of us. So this really is once a life opportunity for all of you who is not yet in crypto. Just please at least find out for your own sake, just to understand, not to listen what others tell you. It's a scam, it's blah, 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 blah. Sure, that's what they're understanding, but you have to find out for yourself.
Chloe, do you have a question though for Jack?
Sorry, yes, my question for Jack.
Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. Jack, I can see from the way you speak, you are very balanced and very living in harmony. So I'm curious. I know that you are very extreme. You are challenge yourself. You are listening to some of your talks, and you say that you love to push boundaries and you love to challenge yourself to do things that you're uncomfortable. That's why you started fasting. So I'm doing that too. And so, and thank God, it is fantastic. Another good point. So, question here. I am in the space, as I just said, less than 1 year. I'm working with DeFi now. I'm a DJ. I'm doing my specialty is DeFi and yield farming. So I'm working for yield farming platform, educate people how to yield farm, how to make your money, create more money. So far so good. I love where I am, and my the club members love what I do. You can see that I'm very passionate about what I do.
Sorry, Chloe, I want to interrupt you because we have several other people that want to ask questions in the conversation, and unfortunately, you just
Okay, I'm
I don't see the
sorry.
question
Okay,
coming. So maybe Aaron, can you maybe go off mute and join the conversation, please?
Sure. Yeah, so I hate to interrupt Chloe though, but I guess sorry, Chloe. Yeah. So hey, Jack, hey, Rolf, how you guys doing?
Nice to see you, Aaron.
Good to see you.
All right.
I spent a lot of time in the fall and winter. This is not a Bitcoin question, so if we could just sort of put Bitcoin to the side firmly, because I think that is its own set of conversation and debate around kind of fiat and all this, and so no opinion on the Bitcoin conversation. But spent a lot of time in the fall and winter really trying to fully assess Web3 in terms of the vision for Web3 and where the technology could possibly go. And obviously, it's my job and probably most people on this call to sort of figure out like which tech trends are going to lead to which outcomes and which ones do you have to bet on and when do you have to bet on them, because obviously if you bet on a trend too early, if you bet on VR 15 years ago, you really wouldn't have a company. And so it's really important to kind of nail sort of where do you think these things are playing out. So I spent a lot of time on that. Obviously annoyed a bunch of people on the internet with random questions. And basically the challenge I ran into, and I'm glad that Balaji just joined, so this that would be fun to hear his thoughts. But the challenge I ran into was many of the most novel things about Web3 were sort of creating these inherent contradictions that led to sort of these inevitable, sort of impossible, problems to square. So, things as simple as if a user becomes the investor or owner of the project, at some point they want to bail because they've made enough profit, and then you kind of, sort of deplete your network effects at some point. Or, to really have true portability, then you have to have the user own the keys, and if they own the keys, then that obviously means you have a bunch of new security risks that the internet is not sort of prepared for. Or to get real true data portability, we need standards amongst individual projects. And to get standards amongst individual projects, you just get really slow development cycles. So kind of ran into a bunch of these issues, and I couldn't quite figure out like where the actual resolution is to these challenges. And I think the industry is sort of talking past each other a little bit, because we keep talking about decentralization. We sort of throw in distributed systems. We talk blockchain, obviously, which is sort of the foundational element of Web3. But we kind of keep punting on the major sort of aspects that become these inherent contradictions. So I think the question could be for Jack or Roelof on the investing side. Like how do you think we navigate this? Jack, I'd love for, because you deeply understand all these things, I'd love for you to try and maybe parse, sort of, I can't reconcile the outcome that people are pitching with actual technology architecture that I've seen. And I don't know if you've been able to reconcile that, or if you have a different sort of view of what decentralization looks like. I mean, Moxie's post, I think, nailed it best, which is you distribute trust, not infrastructure, which is a fundamental, not a subtle point of how you build internet, these sort of scale systems. So would love any thoughts on sort of how do we reconcile some of these contradictions with the ultimate outcome of sort of this, utopian decentralized internet, without basically inevitably just recreating centralized platforms to make all of this stuff abstracted from the user, which then obviously just rebuilds a set of central platforms on, a couple blockchain L1s, kind of in the internet. So any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to hear Rolof's thoughts on these as well. But I think for me, like I think the dangerous thing is we're just, a lot of what I've seen is just not upfront enough. It's not looking critically enough at the technology. I thought Moxie's post was amazing, and for that community to move forward, they need to be able to address those critiques. And I'm not saying that I have doubt that they won't be able to. I do have some doubts that they will be able to on the technologies they're currently on of Ethereum and Solana, but and anything can happen, obviously. But what I was calling out is it just feels like the term decentralized, the term Web3, has been co-opted by some people who aren't being as open as we need them to be, as how they think about investing in this space. And that's actually the conversation I had with Roloff when he called me, is like, here's what I was seeing, and if I were in your position and wanted to invest in this space, like, here's what I would do. And certainly I think a big factor of that is you have to invest in the open source community without having any expectation of return for yourself. And I think you have to invest in something like Bitcoin as well, which is not getting the same amount of investments because there's not the same amount of opportunity for VCs around it. This is what I think it is. But it is something fundamental that has inspired everything around it, and will continue to do so as it goes on. But I'd love to hear Roloff.
Darren, I'm not as steeped in the details of the technology as I think you've spent time on. But I sort of think about the arc of technologies that I've seen over decades, and I worry that there's too much of a design philosophy rather than an evolutionary philosophy at play, where people try to sketch an ultimate vision for an outcome, but it's far more iterative in how you get there. And instead of creating this very high level vision how everything should work, I'm much more interested, as Jack said earlier, in the utility. Explain to me what problem this solves for which customer and what does it do. And maybe there's a business, maybe it's open source, it doesn't matter, but explain to me the details. And I suspect that these technologies are going to be built much like ancient cities are built, sort of layer upon layer, rather than some grandiose design that is invented by somebody else. That's my intuition. So
Yeah, and I think the issue is not that I'm expecting central planning on this. It's that technology does follow these sort of evolutionary arcs, and the arc that we're seeing is actually pretty predictable, because we've actually been through these eras many times, which is you end up getting centralization because end users want some form of trust and reliable system that they can go to. So the question is, why would this buck that trend? And if it doesn't, then that's actually totally fine, to Jack's earlier point. But then maybe we shouldn't be sort of overhyping the decentralized aspect of it. And if we do, overhype the decentralized aspect of it, maybe we should understand why fundamentally will this be different. And if the reason why it's different don't architecturally sort of make sense or economically make sense, then you just have a puzzle that you can't square. So that's sort of what I've run into. Yeah.
Yes, but I think this is part of why I suspect Jack is as drawn to Bitcoin as he is, because I think if you went back a decade and said there's going to be this distributed money that has a trillion or whatever of market cap that people trust, I think it would have seemed far-fetched, but it is proven to be resilient. And so that is a use case that is actually decentralized and has all the properties that has enabled it to endure.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's actually why I think it works maybe for a couple of types of things where we all collectively as a globe agree that, I'm not saying that we have or haven't, but like if everybody, and I would assume this is Jack's opinion, if everybody agrees that, okay, this is the internet money, then you have enough network effect and stability that everybody can sort of trust it. But the challenge is that if every single day yet another decentralized project that is yet also trying to create another set of portability standards emerges, you don't ever get enough stability for enough people to develop common patterns on those things to actually produce the sort of network effects that are then needed for anybody to adopt this stuff. So, but I do agree with you. Like when there is pure utility, then it all makes sense. And the challenge has been sort of how do we, how does this actually play out over time with some of these challenges? But I'll rest the mic from here.
Thanks, and I think Annie was next.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm just trying to jump in. So my question is, thank you, Jack and Roland, for having this session. And I like the comment that you said in terms of like money that we send back home. I'm from Nigeria. Money we send back home is in the billions, and of course, transaction fees are crazy. But I didn't hear you talk about DeFi. I'm currently building out a DeFi platform on Hedera, which I also didn't hear you mention. I heard you mention Solana. I heard you mention, ETH. And I didn't hear you mention anything about the DeFi community. So is there, what are your thoughts on that? And, as I look to educate the community, which is the plans for the coming year on blockchain across the board, what are the things that
You're breaking up a bit, Annie, but I think I get your question. And interrupt if you come back on. But I don't bring up DeFi a lot because I think we have to get the money fixed first. And if we don't go after the most important foundational element to start, everything on top will also be compromised. And I just don't think that's a great way of building any system. So I think, Bitcoin has come an incredibly far way since its inception. And I think it can enable so much more. But there are some basic fundamentals that need to be strengthened, such as security, such as privacy, such as anonymity, accessibility, obviously. Um, Wallets becoming much easier for people to use anywhere in the world. And getting that right and getting that strong enables entirely new financial use cases. And that's where I think DeFi is trying to play, although I'm not sure, because all these terms unfortunately are ill-defined and no one really knows what they mean. So I could say Web3 and it could mean literally anything that I want to fit it into. And the same thing for DeFi and decentralized finance. Like, what is that? I don't know, but I do know that the one thing that everything relies upon needs to be fixed. Currently, it's on a fiat system that's majorly controlled by banks and governments, and all that information, all those decisions are behind closed doors or locked away in algorithms, and it is definitively leaving people out of the economy. Let's fix that problem. And when we fix that problem and the economy is more accessible to every single one on the same level playing field, then we can build all the other systems that we think are necessary. I don't think all the ones we've built or used today are necessary, and many of them are probably predatory and useless as well. So I don't want to just blindly replicate all those, which I think is happening a bit too much and too quickly and a bit too recklessly. Again, there's plenty of good ideas out there, and I imagine that some of them will bear fruit for use cases that people need, but we got to fix the fundamentals first.
Okay, can we go back to the question of education? So, as you know, education for me is key in terms of the continent. And like you mentioned, predatory, because I'm in banking, so I completely understand that to the 10th power. So you mentioned education. You mentioned the fact that there are words that are being thrown around, things that are being created that make no sense. Can we talk about the fact that the continent is seeing this and wanting to be involved? You have built out this foundation that you are going to do education. What type of education would you now continue onto the continent? And as a person that I am that's going to be doing education this year, what topics should we focus in on? Because I don't want our people to get scammed, left and right with everything that's happening in terms of being predatory. And all they're seeing is buzzwords, NFTs,
Yeah.
this, that, and that. So, we are going to tackle that with a non-biased approach without mentioning any companies whatsoever. But what other topics would you consider that we should take into consideration as we move forward with education?
I think the biggest one. I mean, you bring up a ton of great points. I think the biggest one, like that will endure, is how do we incentivize more long-term thinking? How do we incentivize people to like think deeply about how they're participating in the economy, why they are, what the rules are around it, and decide for themselves if there's actually real value and understand risk. I mean, another big uh, piece of education that I think is ignored is just the ability to measure risk and make informed decisions around when I take risk or when I don't. And that's a skill that's learned through experience. It's learned through mistakes. But there's a thread there that you can start pulling that everyone can learn from. That you don't. It doesn't require a ton of experience. It's just like bringing up the word risk and understanding what that means and what it looks like and what controls you have. I think is really important. Hopefully, the products we build, the wallets we build, and the networks we build show enough information, especially to people who want to get deeper and deeper. It just progressively discloses even more that they can learn from it. Then they don't have to be engineers. They don't have to be programmers. They don't have to be understand basic computer science if successful. But that should be the role of the products. Is it should help guide them into informed decisions. I think that's the most important thing. But long-term thinking and understanding risk, I think would be my focus areas for education.
Thank you so much. That will definitely be our key focus in some of the workshops that we host. And I look forward to getting more information on what you're building so that we could share that to the communities that. So thank you so much for taking my questions.
Thank you for your work.
Thanks.
Balaji?
Hey, Jack.
Hey.
Hey, Roelof. I've got a few quick bullets to hit. Let me know your thoughts, kind of questions / comments. So Jack, like I think we've known each other a little bit, a lot of values, but may differ on some tactics. But just going one by one. First, in terms of decentralization, I think a key concept is whether decentralization is a binary thing or whether it can be quantified, and if so, is it continuous? And there's actually a paper we put out like 5 years ago called "Quantifying Decentralization" that actually proposed a measure of this. But the intuition is that the degree of decentralization of a decentralized system is it's got a bunch of different choke points. It could be miners, it could be exchanges, it could be developers, and it's basically the minimum number of entities you need to compromise the system as a whole. And so if you take that mental model, the reason I think that's a useful one is once you can quantify decentralization, you can say, okay, given scarce resources, how do we improve it? How do we optimize it? Do we hire another 5 developers? Do we get 2 more clients? Where's the choke points of the system? The reason I say this is that usually the way it's discussed is, Bitcoin is decentralized, everything else is not. But if you can quantify decentralization, first, that means Bitcoin can become more decentralized over time. Second, you can quantify whether, say, a new platform is more decentralized than, say, Facebook. And so in general, I think there's a perfect is the enemy of the good aspect if we just think of decentralization as binary as opposed to quantifying it, think about where the threats to decentralization are and allocating capital accordingly. Love your thoughts on that.
I agree with that. I mean, my issue is that a lot of the Web3 discussions have led with decentralization, though, and
Yeah.
that just doesn't feel right. So if you're if you're arguing for quantifying that more and giving people upfront information around what pieces are decentralized and what pieces are currently centralized or have a path towards decentralization, that's great. But I I don't think decentralization should ever be the lead in the conversation, because it's not the true utility. The true utility is resilience, it's security, it's direct ownership, it's a transparent operation and transparent code base. Like those are the utilities, especially when I consider my money and my money supply that I want. I want to know it, and if it's more secure because it's decentralized, amazing. And like, look, we're Cash App is a centralized entity, and we fully are aware of that. We're providing a security service at the end of the day. We've centralized the security of it, but we don't think that should be the only answer, which is why we're building a non-custodial wallet that will be, again, completely open source, because we don't think that's the right choice for everyone to trust a corporation like ours. We hope they do, and we're going to work our best towards that and provide an amazing service in security. But the goal isn't decentralization. It's more like, how do I make a decision around an attribute that I want more control over, and in that case, it's security or it's privacy or direct ownership. So I think if what you're saying is more transparency and how to quantify that, 100%, absolutely.
Okay. Can I ask you a few more? Is that okay? I've got a few more items.
Yeah, maybe one more, just so we can get to some other speakers.
One quick one. So I think maybe the most fundamental question is, I think of Bitcoin as necessary but not sufficient, and the reason is because, for example, privacy coins, like you can be traced on chain unless you're a very sophisticated Bitcoin user. It's easy to trace you on chain basically for the rest of your life and everybody who interacts with you. Whereas zero knowledge, hides that and protects you from financial surveillance. Or programmability, Bitcoin is meant to be a tank, and Satoshi intentionally disabled a lot of the opcodes originally because they were potential security risks. But programmability is sort of at odds with immutability, which is one of Bitcoin's core value propositions. And so, moreover, like the reason I think about the crypto economy is Bitcoin has become the currency of the crypto economy. A huge part of Bitcoin's value proposition is that it can be used in flash loans and it can be used in all of this financial stuff, which frankly is not like the kind of stuff that I care about all that much. I care about freedom, but I recognize it as something that provides an incentive for the uptake of the system. And Satoshi's big thing initially was Adam Smithian protocol design. He didn't say that it was because of the like the good nature of the miners and so on that they would do something, but because of their economic incentives. And so putting all that together, you mentioned that Bitcoin doesn't have the same incentives for developing on top. I think we both agree on privacy. We both agree on things like user custody, user control, on things of getting like pieces of the financial system out of the hands of like Western governments and Western banks. And so I guess my question to you is, I think of Bitcoin as necessary but not sufficient for that ecosystem. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think it is both necessary and not sufficient for all the use cases they mentioned right now, although a number of those problems are being solved. You just look at Lightning, you look at projects like Sapio that allow for a little bit more programmability. Again, I think the focus has been on the stability and the security to start, and we're getting closer and closer to that. But that does allow other layers on top to exist with entirely new use cases. I guess the issue for me is like when Ethereum and Solana are described as money, as currency, that just feels wrong given the core attributes that they have and how relatively centralized they are in comparison to Bitcoin. And I mean that only in the security fashion and the fact that like one person ultimately determines the direction of those chains. Now, if you're thinking about them for generalized distributed computing, that's another thing, and I think it's perfectly okay. But again, let's be upfront about what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are, and not try to see this thing as absolutely everything, because I think that gets us into some traps down the line.
Great, awesome, thanks, guys.
Awesome. Olumide? I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. Olumide. Yeah. So, good question. Sorry, Jack. I have three questions, but I'll try to break it to two. First of all, I want to have your view on what CBDC's impact will have on the crypto market in the long term. The second question is that do you think that the pending crypto regulation, especially from the United States and the one coming in Europe, will have a structural effect on uh, Bitcoin and many other altcoins? The last question is that I want to have your take on the fact that there are growing concerns that the stable coin industry prints are overbooting a lot of crypto assets by valuation. Do you think we're in a bubble? Thank you.
I'd love to hear Rolof's thoughts on the last one, if we're on a bubble or not. I mean, certainly there are signs that we are. We are. But on the first one, like I think the central bank digital coins are more the same and probably much worse than what we have with the fiat systems, because there's a lot more control by the centralized parties, and they don't come with the transparency that I think we deserve and is our right, especially as we consider this is something we live and die by. Ultimately, this money that we all use. So I'm very, very skeptical of all of them, and certainly open-minded, but I can't imagine that being comparable to what Bitcoin has already achieved, and the fairness that it allows for all the people around the world. Raul, if you have a point on the last question.
Yeah, on the bubble question, I think in any given period, assets are mispriced. And one of the board members we have at Block has this wonderful phrase, David Vanier. He has this phrase: in the long run, the only thing that drives your stock price is the company's performance. And in the short run, who knows? And that's the mantra that we have in all the companies that I work with, is just stay focused on building value. And in the long run, it'll be reflected in your share price. When it comes to all these other asset classes, we've been in this period of incredibly low inflation and lots of fiscal stimulus. And so, at one point last year, there was over $15 trillion in Europe that was earning a negative yield, meaning that you left your money in the bank account, the bank literally took money away. You had less 12 months later than you did at the beginning. And in an environment like that, people chase returns wherever they can find them. And so some of that showed up in stocks, some of that showed up in real estate, some of that showed up in commodity prices. And so I think lots of things were priced differently. For me to say it's a bubble, I think that's too strong a word I wouldn't use. And now as interest rates go up and as inflation goes up, future cash flows are going to be discounted and worth less. And so a bunch of assets are now being repriced. But honestly, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. I spend my time focused on finding great entrepreneurs and helping them build businesses. That's the key thing. So Jack, Elena is a crypto founder who's on the call as well and has raised the hand. Can we bring her on stage?
Yeah, Elena.
Awesome. Hi. Thank you so much for doing this Q&A. Yeah, so I'm working on Ironfish, which is a new privacy chain that supports only shielded transactions using zero-knowledge proofs. And our goal is to be the universal layer for all crypto assets by allowing you to transfer assets to Ironfish so you can transact them totally privately. So think of this as like a universal privacy layer for all assets. And so in a way, we're trying to get money fixed, as you say it, by private digital money, and we hope to support Bitcoin in the future as well. And it sounds like privacy is something that you resonate with also. And our project definitely would not have been possible without VC money. So my question is, and I know you've touched on this before, why do you feel so negatively around VCs fueling the space with awesome projects that lift crypto as a whole? Because a lot of projects kind of like ours are more on the infrastructure layer that actually make the ecosystem, in my personal opinion, way better and way stronger.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I I don't just blanket hate VCs in the space. My tweet was originally around, you know what you're getting into, do the research on who owns it and who controls it and who holds the governance tokens, because that's not being, or it wasn't being talked about at all. And when you're building a lot of these technologies that are being marketed as completely decentralized, and you have a bunch of similar parties in them as you did in quote unquote Web 2, um, is that actually what, you know, is that what you thought it was? And I think there have been some surprises in terms of what this means and what it looks like going forward. I certainly see the necessity, and I appreciate the role of the VC. I would focus on the individuals rather than the firms personally, but um, I, I think people just have to be aware of like what they're building, what they're using,